Well, hello there, Banditos. Welcome to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this Wednesday, December 21st. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Mike Farah.
And our buddy Oren could not be here today. However, we are going to soldier on as usual, give the man a rest with all those Oren only episodes. I think he's due yet again another respite. But today we're bringing you our interview with J.H. Williams the third. That's right, the third.
Trace.
There's three of them. Really interesting person, great career, and he's done some really great work.
So I kind of fanboyed out with JH. I am a humongous fan of his work with Alan Moore on Promethea, which if you have not read it or seen it or witnessed it or just taken it all in, it is just an amazing series. And the way JH sort of breaks down the layouts and just explodes the panels basically of the comic book and changes what a comic book can be was amazing to me. And so we get into that. We also get into Sandman Overture, which, similarly groundbreaking, a great story. And as I say in the interview, turning the books this way and that because they're going, upside down and topsy-turvy. Crazy stuff, guys. I implore you to look out for all of his work. He is doing Echolands now. You should get that. That's in sort of a widescreen format. But you know what? I'm going to stop blathering and we're going to get to the interview. This is J.H. Williams.
All right. Hey, thanks for joining us, everyone. And we're going to start the same way we start every interview. J.H., how did you first discover comics?
Let's see. I know I've told this story a lot, so let me see if I can make it a simple version so for people don't get bored with it. Basically, when I was a kid, I lived in the Bay Area. I grew up in the Bay Area and grew up around, comics in the stores all the time. Like, they would be at the grocery store, 7-Eleven, pretty much everywhere. And so I was exposed to them really, really young. I don't remember like a specific age, the first time I discovered a comic book, but I have memories of, running into Marvel comics and stuff, some DCs, in the grocery stores. I remember seeing them on the magazine racks in the grocery stores and be like, oh, I want that. I want that. I also remember we used to go to like this all-American food diner place called Bob's Big Boy. And I remember they had their own comic books that they would hand out to kids.
Really?
Yeah, that's featuring cool. They had like this character that they created called Big Boy. And they had these comics featuring that character. I wish I still had some of them. It'd be kind of interesting to see what they're like,
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We've heard of that chain. It's pretty well known. Never knew they had their own, comic books. At least around here, they just get the placemat where you color on it. That's it.
Yeah, I don't know when they stopped making them, but they were like, I don't know, really cheap, probably little 10-page comics or something like that. From, I remember reading those all the time.
That's pretty cool.
And you professionally broke in with Milestone Media, right? Which was an imprint of DC.
Yeah, kind of. It was weird. I was doing that at the same time. It's strange. So I had done some independent stuff before that, where it was for like small publishers that don't exist anymore, like Now Comics or Innovation Comics. Like I did an issue of Twilight Zone of all things.
That's cool.
Some short Hero Alliance stories. But I really started to try, pursue the bigger publishers as much as possible. And I was doing that rounds around the same time Milestone was coming up. But I was also doing so I got access through them, but then through DC proper, I was doing a short story for DC Showcase. which was a Green Lantern story. And so those kind of things were all happening around the same time.
Interesting. Well, I thought so when you came to my attention was actually through the milestone work and on
Yeah.
the Deathwish miniseries.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and what I find when I'm sort of looking at your bibliography is that either you gravitate towards characters that are certainly skewed or off of mainstream, or else you've been sort of have fallen into that. Is there one versus the other? Do you sort of gravitate towards them, or is it just how you've been, like how they've been assigned to you, or where the opportunity has been?
I guess a little bit of all of that. So before I did the Deathwish miniseries, I had done, like I said, that Showcase Green Lantern. I don't know if it came out when the Showcase Green Lantern story came out versus when I started the other work, because some of that stuff was overlapping in time. And sometimes things don't get published in the order that they were done. So before the Deathwish miniseries, there was the Green Lantern short story, some of that independent stuff I mentioned, and a couple issues of Blood Syndicate. I did some fill-ins for Blood Syndicate, and that led to the Deathwish mini. But as far as unusual characters are concerned, it was like never like a conscious thing that was happening. I doubt anybody thought, oh, this guy would be good for such and such. It was more like I was making an impression with the work I was doing somehow. I don't know how. That old stuff is pretty wonky. But I was making an impression with the stuff I was doing. I was getting stuff done when they wanted it done. And when they started looking for somebody to do such and such, my name would come up for something like Deathwish. And for me, the subject matter of some of these things, I don't know. I don't really consider them outside. I know some people thought, would think that some of that stuff might be pushing the boundaries, but for me, I just feel like it's, even though they're unusual characters, I'm still working on characters that are people, if that makes sense. And I don't know. I've been asked a similar question before, because some of the characters I ended up being known for doing a lot of female characters too. But it was never like a conscious thing. It was more like, this would be cool to do, that was sort of the trajectory there.
So what I have to ask about your artistic style. It's fascinating, and it seems you're doing more than just coloring a character or a background or what have you. It seems like your choice of colors are very deliberate. And I would love to know, am I just blowing smoke by saying that, or what are some of your artistic inspirations when you were kind of developing your style?
Well, in terms of color choice, it's funny because when I was coming up in the comics industry at that time, you were very much kind of told that the work should work in black and white and color. So that was kind of a thing. But at the same time, knowing you're going to be published in color did lead me to think about images on the final end of the end result of everything. And so I kind of felt like I was forced to think about color in terms of as a storyteller, like, this scene might be cool if it has a blue hue, or this character, no one has seen this character's colors should be such and such and such and such, because of whatever visual impact I was thinking of at the time might resonate for somebody reading it. So I very quickly early on gravitated to a sense of design and thinking about design and color presentation in conjunction with the work being able to function in black and white. I don't know about other artists how much they, you know, think about the color. I'm sure some of them do, but there's also a lot of artists out there like they're just all about creating that killer black and white image too. Um, as far as my own style, I don't know. Like in the early days, I don't know what I was after. Um, I felt like I was trying to find my own voice, but at the same time, there was this sort of pressure to deliver what the editors were looking for. Um, and that was constantly morphing all the time while trying to break in, which led to me thinking about dabbling with different techniques and styles because which was something I was sort of inherently interested in before trying to break into comics. I was interested in artists that could kind of navigate different effects and different styles. And so early on, when I was trying to break into comics, I was doing some independent stuff, you know, trying to find self-publishing, whatever. And some of that stuff would be completely different types of genres. And instead of approaching them with the same mindset for the style, I kind of catered my style to what each of those stories needed, what they felt like and required. And that led me to kind of being all over the place in dabbling with my style. And you know, I'd say early on there was definitely more of a focus to be hard black and white, but as I kept evolving over the years, that slowly changed and morphed. Um, so yeah, it's hard to say where the original inspiration came from, other than when I was a kid being attracted to certain artists over others. You know, and that of course makes an impact.
Mm-hmm.
So like people like Michael Golden, I was insane over Michael Golden. My first exposure to him was from the Micronauts. But then because I lived in the Bay Area in California, was able to be exposed to a wide range of comics. So it wasn't just the superhero stuff. I would see comics by Mobius and things like that. And of course, like things like Conan the Barbarian, even, stuff that wasn't typically superheroes. And all these things had a diverse style to them. The Micronauts compared to Uncanny X-Men, compared to a Mobius graphic novel, compared to a Jack Kirby comic, all four of those things are drastically different. And those were all being imprinted on my mind when I was young. So those things definitely had an influence on me early on. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I find, the artwork, and I find artwork that goes into comics to be, it's amazing, and I find it fascinating to talk to the artists about how they achieve that, because they all have their own method, their own reason for doing it. Of course, you have some that are just like, look, this is the job, and I'm coloring Batman, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. And that's fine. Everyone has their own motivations. But, I think when you have artwork of, people such as yourself that really stands out for, particular reasons, and I just find that fascinating. So definitely, very much so. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things I was trying to do early on was, I don't know, it's such a highly competitive field. Even back then when I was trying to get into it, it's even more so now. But back then it was so highly competitive. I was just constantly trying to analyze and think of ways that my work could be, I don't know, different from the person standing next to me in the portfolio line, And so that kind of became important. But as I matured and started growing into what I was doing, I kind of learned a hard lesson in that anything I was thinking of or being influenced by, someone's already treaded that ground, and so I kind of let go of trying to have a distinct style, for lack of a better description, and focus more on just concentrating on whatever the story is telling me it needs. I'd say I've found more of my voice in my design sense, the way I approach a scene, not necessarily how it's drawn, but if that makes any sense. I very much gravitated to trying to think about comics in a way that you don't see very often, I guess.
I am going to probably assail you with questions on that with Promethea coming up. Okay. But before we get to that and all of the amazing layouts there, and not to compare at all, but just looking at the arc of your career, I wanted to ask about your two Elseworlds projects.
Oh, cool.
Justice Riders, Son of Superman. Kind of early on, I guess, in the arc of your career. These are one-shot stories. They're set out of continuity, although as Joe will note, everything counts now, and so things are coming back. Right. But certainly back then you thought this is never going to continue on past the one shot. But did you see those as opportunities to kind of work on bigger characters, but not be beholden to the kind of like model of those characters that you had to work with? You could really kind of like loosen up, but yet have some, familiarity there.
Yeah, I'd say, like with Justice Riders in particular, because it was so much of a Western. It's kind of a strange, weird Western. But the reality that Chuck Dixon created for that was so distinctly a Western that you easily can divorce yourself from the typical iconography of those characters that were these westernized versions of these characters, where and so you end up coming up with a whole different. It's weird because like they're still superpowered characters, and so you still try to have that superhero flair, but with a Western attitude. It's a weird kind of amalgam of things there, where with Son of Superman, even though it's sort of like a near future story in a way, I felt like I still had to be a little bit more thoughtful about the Superman iconography, much more so than in Justice Riders. While, like you said, there's still a bit of a freedom there, because you kind of want people to recognize and hit those notes that they can relate to it, in the fact that they know a Superman book. But hopefully the way the type of story being told gives them something a different flavor of it, if that makes sense. What was super fun about that one was getting to design the older aging Superman, and using black and white for his uniform versus his son trying to don the red and blue, the more colorful. And so it's kind of the symbolism of that is kind of interesting. That was cool to do. I don't remember if there was any notes about that in the script. It might have been something I just, let's try this. How do we make this aging Superman different than the Superman we all know, because his son's already using the red and blue that we know. So what do we do different for him, so.
So as Mike said, everything counts apparently. Well, that's DC's words, not ours. But do you think the work that you did on that really kind of set the groundwork for what they're putting out now as it pertains to Son of Superman? Because that's a character now. That's a legit in continuity character, and I will go out on a limb and say, like, yeah, it definitely was. I mean, it's not that
I'm not overly familiar with what they're doing. I know that in the current comics, he has a son, John Kent, right?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Is it based on the? what Chaykin had kind of came up with, or is it sort of like
It's
here's a new take
Jonathan
on that
Kent.
idea?
It's this, the way they got there is different.
Okay.
They combined. I guess they basically smashed New 52 Superman in continuity with the old, and he was a byproduct of that, for lack of a better term. And they don't want to get rid of him, so now he's a legit character,
I see.
and he's trying to take off and do his own thing. But
Yeah,
but Clark is still there, and they seem to be moving ever so slowly towards that older looking Superman that I think everyone really kind of likes personally.
yeah.
Like the gray haired, almost Kingdom Come look of
I
Superman.
think that's it right there. People are obsessed with the Kingdom Come stuff.
Yeah, it is pretty badass though. I mean, when I saw Brandon Routh don that outfit, I was like, I'm in. The rest of the show stinks, but that character was great. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I guess you kind of answered it, but it seems like, certainly as pertains to the work you did and what a lot of others have done as in relation to Elseworlds, they're trying to get the best of both worlds, bring back all these characters people adore from Elseworlds, but bring them into continuity, which
Interesting.
it's, I guess there's no question here, it's just me talking. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's fine.
But yeah, I mean, they're kind of ruining the novelty of Elseworlds in my opinion. What made those unique is that they were one shots and they were really cool. But when you start, folding them into the real continuity, then okay, now you have to kind of dig at that their history, and you may disappoint people. But
True. It's interesting that they're doing that. I kind of figure, like, originally DC's was thinking like Elseworlds was their version of What If, but taken a little bit more to the extreme, I guess you could say. So it's interesting that they're trying to incorporate some of those things into saying, oh no, all this stuff is possible.
Well, when you have a crisis every year, you got to do something, right?
True. Out of the two of those, I had a great time on Son of Superman. But out of the two of those, I think it'd be really cool to revisit something like the Justice Riders. There was people that kept kind of loosely floating that idea. I guess the other sort of Elseworlds thing that I was involved with was that Flash annual too. Was it Dead Earth or whatever it was called?
So, I know you were involved with Tangent.
Yeah.
The Green Lantern, which also is a thing.
Yeah.
In continuity, like that character has made appearances recently.
That's
so funny. They're all there.
Yeah.
Justice Riders, though, and Joe, you're more up on it than I am, but I think Justice Riders has not yet.
I haven't read it, but again, Dark Crisis is still going on, so there's probably like 3 more issues left. So you never know.
Well, they'll do a smash into a new universe where everyone's a Western character. The entirety of the DC universe is set in a Western reality.
They throw Jonah Hex when they could, and he has a daughter apparently, so I don't see why not.
Yeah, I mean I remember the old Jonah Hex stories where he traveled to the future at one point or something like that. So why not put him in an alternate dimension and where he's coming up against all these other DC characters who are now Western versions.
Oh yeah,
it'd be funny if he could tell too. Like he could recognize, like, I know you from somewhere else
back then. Yeah, it seems like Westerns as a genre like come back every 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And so if you can sort of harness that energy, I think you got a good shot at a Justice Riders sequel.
Oh, absolutely.
I think if DC tried to do a West, I don't know how the readers would respond, but like make it a big deal, like this, the horror stuff that they've been doing with, where they're showing that kind of thing. It's like, well, if you're going to do that, then let's do a similar event that's a different genre, right? It'd be cool.
Oh yeah, for sure. I agree.
Justice Riders are on Earth 18, just so you know.
So they're real.
Are they the only things on Earth 18?
I don't know. There's stars.
I love it. You could get into so much minutia.
Yeah.
With this stuff. Okay, so I wanted to turn to Promethea, which for me was a magnum opus, both for you and Alan Moore. I know Alan is usually associated more with a different magnum opus, which is fine and dandy, and I love it too. But Promethea just, slayed me, honestly. So first of all, thank you for your contribution to that, which was huge.
Thanks.
So I'd like to start at the beginning, which is, how did this come about? How did you get involved with this title? And did Alan give you adequate warning of what was coming down the line in terms of what would be needed in terms of art?
Let's see, the way it got started, funnily enough, I was working on Son of Superman. While also, what else was I doing at the same time with Son of Superman? There's something else I was doing at the same time. I can't remember what it was. Because that came after Chase, the Son of Superman thing, I think. I believe so, yeah. But it's so funny because like when you start thinking back on the old projects, they start to like all mash up together in my head, and you're like, wait, when did what happen? Pretty weird. But
Desolation Jones, I think that came later, right? Yes,
that came out after Promethea. That was a thing I did immediately after that. So Promethea, I was working on Son of Superman. I think I had pages to show. It was after Chase. And I get a call from Scott Doombeer, basically saying, hey, I got this thing I want to talk to you about. It involves Alan Moore, but I need you to sign an NDA before I can talk to you about it. So I did that. And then and then he proceeded to tell me what the project was. And it was for this book called Promethea. And he was noting that I was recommended to him from Alex Ross. Later, I found out I was also recommended to him from Todd Klein. And I don't know how familiar Scott was with my work at the time. And it was honest and said, look, we've talked to a bunch of, different people. You're further down the list. They talked to people like Alan Davis. Can't remember who else they said, Pete Craig Russell, maybe some other people that I'm like, oh, that's intimidating. But they all said no for whatever reason. They just didn't want to do it for whatever reason. And so he started searching more widely, and that's when I think my name got brought up. And I think, I don't know, maybe Alex had seen my work on Chase, and Chase had kind of like a semi-realistic touch to it, but did some interesting things with some layout and story construction. Some of the things we did were unusual. I don't know, maybe he thought that would appeal to Alan. So Scott asked me if I had a bunch of samples I could send that he would forward to Alan. And so I collected together a bunch of different things, all the Chase things. In particular, I very much wanted to send Chase, and especially issue 1 million of Chase, because that's when I think we really started going, how much can we toy with what the page looks like? And being a fan of Alan Moore, my gut told me that would appeal to him. And so I sent that stuff. I get a call back from Scott, and he's like, Alan says you're the guy. You want to do it. And of course, I was super nervous to say yes because it's Alan Moore. I'm freaking out about it, trying to be cool on the phone. And so I'm like, can I have a day to think about it? And Scott was, it was hilarious because Scott was like, what is there to think about? It's Alan Moore. But I don't know. I was like overwhelmed by the situation. And so I said, I'll talk to you about it tomorrow. And of course, when I got off the phone, I'm, jumping up and down and exclaiming to my wife, and we're all excited. So we knew we were going to say yes, right? But it was one of those things that was like, I don't know. But that's kind of how it came about. I had never spoken to Alan before any of that until after I was, offered the project. And then my first phone conversations with Alan were, he basically was kind of outlining like, I want to do a book about magic, but not magic comics like we're used to in terms of like Doctor Strange or anything like that. He wanted to push the boundaries of what to expect from that, which is interesting because like the first 10 to 12 issues of Promethea, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of standard magic comics tropes in it. Even though he's talking about real, Kabbalistic magic stuff in there, it doesn't really dive in deep until after that first, third of the book, and that's when we really go off the deep end. So I guess in terms of what to expect, I really didn't know what to expect, other than it was going to be a different type of magic book, a fantasy book, but the way he talked about, but presenting magic, but real magic. That's the way I think how he kind of put it across the first time he spoke on the phone. In terms of the artistic journey that we went, I think one of the things that helped propel that was my conversations with him when we first got started. I think he could tell really quickly that I was willing to go over the cliff with him, that I was willing to try anything, and I was throwing ideas back at him for different techniques, different styles, different whatever things to try. And so we kind of fed off of each other in that way. And I think that allowed the series to grow and evolve into something more profound than what that first third represents.
I mean, some of those splash pages or double splash pages are among the most intricately and densely populated images I've ever seen committed to page. Which big kudos to you. And you somewhat answered already that it seemed to be you both feeding off each other, not necessarily, I think Alan is fairly famous for having very detailed scripts.
Yeah.
But you also were bringing in from, I guess, what the samples they were giving you from Chase, this very different version of blowing out what a layout could look like on a page.
Right.
What, for one of those, how long did it take for one of those really big splash pages to come together? I mean, were you working on that? Did those take, weeks and months to just do those couple pages in some instances?
I wouldn't say that long, but it definitely took longer than what would be expected. I think towards the tail end, not probably even the tail end, probably very quickly, Promethea turned into a situation where we were only able to produce like 4 or 5 issues a year, I think, is what ended up happening. I don't know. I can't remember how quickly we got to that point. So yeah, nothing on that book was the typical type of schedule. But I tried to maintain as much as possible 2 pages a week of pencils. But there was points where it took longer, and there's times where it may have taken shorter. but that was also, working with an inker too. I think if I was inking that stuff myself, the process might not have been even at that speed. It's hard to know. Uh, Based on what it's taking me to do some of the Echolands work I'm doing now, probably would not be, it would take a while. But in terms of the back and forth that we were talking about, yeah, it was one of the coolest things about that experience was how collaborative Alan is on that stuff. He'll hand over like these insane scripts, but sometimes those scripts will be based on things we talked about before he wrote them. And so sometimes some of the ideas, or say I wanted to work in an impressionist style for what, as just a loose example, I would say that, and he would write with that in mind, knowing that's what how I was going to approach it. And as far as the elaborate design sense, I'd say probably realistically it's like 50% Alan, 50% me. And sometimes, as well, almost all the time, as detailed as his scripts would be, that was so great about him is he'd always like, well, if you see it differently, go for it. And I didn't realize how literal he meant that until one time, I'm like, oh, I think this should go a different way. And I would call him about it. And he's like, it's your show now. I've written the thing. Go, if you think that's going to work, then go for it. You had complete trust in whatever I wanted to do, which is fantastic, especially at that time of my career. And really gave me more confidence to see what I could do and where my mind could go with some of that stuff.
I was going to say that exact same thing. That must have been such a vote of confidence in your ability. I felt at certain times like a crazy person because I was, some of those pages that I'm describing, I'm twisting in because at least one, maybe more, was in somewhat of a spiral layout, and I'm like, I was like, I'm definitely reading this at home. I can't read this one on the subway because people are gonna
right.
quickly move away from me. Anyway, thank you. I will say it again for that work of art.
Thanks. I mean, I think some of those ideas where the pages wanted to where we're forcing you to go read in a complete circle, or, like the Mobius strip page where it does, the infinity loop thing, yep. All those kinds of things were just basically one of the things Alan was trying to get across in Promethea, which you probably will agree with this, was challenging your notion of perception. And by forcing you to read something in a way that you're not comfortable with, that takes you out of the expected rhythm of what you would think to read something, is forcing you to address your sense of perception about reality, which I think is brilliant on his part, of course.
So along the lines of Mike and, his admiration for Promethea, I really enjoyed the work you did with Grant Morrison on Seven Soldiers.
Thanks.
I love not just the artwork, but just pulling those characters together. To just, for me at the time, just seemed most random characters to come together, and
right.
And the fact that you have like Clarion the Witch Boy, which prior to that I had seen him in like Young Justice, as like a kid. And, to see him, of course, this is a few years after the fact, now in this, which is certainly much more serious, was just a fabulous, fabulous series. And I would say, Grant Morrison, right up there with Alan Moore, in terms of just his brain, I mean, they're of the same, they have similar philosophies, I would say, about a lot of things. What was that experience like working with Grant Morrison to create that series?
What was interesting to me is when it was first pitched to me, I knew what the structure was going to be. So I knew that they wanted me to do the bookends that come, on all these miniseries sit between these bookends. But I didn't know at first that the issue 0 was going to feature characters that were not going to be in any of the miniseries. My original thought is, when I first started reading who the characters were in that issue 0, I'm like, oh, they're going to go off and that's going to branch out into their own thing. But it was great that Grant killed them. That they, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read it, but everyone dies in that first chapter. So that was really interesting. I thought, I was like, cool. And in some ways I thought, great. Also, that meant nothing I was doing, anyone else had to worry about for any of those other miniseries. But then that kind of doubled back on me when it came time to do the last chapter, because that came into fruition before the others were completed. And
okay.
So I didn't know how each of those were going to end up, but I did early on, before I got the final script, Grant told me that it, will be a direct continuation of what happens in those miniseries. So then it became a situation where what those people were doing was going to have an influence and impact on anything I choose to do in that bookend, the final chapter, which was interesting and a good challenge for me, because it kind of brought me back to a similar idea of thinking, like, to let myself go from it and think about what those people were doing and how do I capture the same energy and feel of what those things were. So it made sense to the reader. That was my first and foremost concern, was like, this has to work for the reader. Mm-hmm. The toughest part was, I remember meeting with Grant at some bar in, I think, Oakland during a WonderCon, because he wanted to talk about the last chapter before it was completely done. And
he seems to do a lot of his discussions in bars. He's not the first person to say that, too. Someone else we spoke to not too long ago said, they flew me to Scotland, and I met him in a bar, and we talked about, it was about Final Crisis. Oh, crap.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were talking about Final Crisis in a bar. I'm like, wow. Because I have to be drunk to understand that sometimes. Sorry.
So he wanted to pick my brain about different ways to approach the last chapter before he settled on a final script, because he said, I have 80 pages of material that I have to cram into 40.
Wow.
And he started like running different things by me to get my impression of ways to tackle some stuff, to kind of like streamline it. I don't know how helpful I was, but that was interesting to be involved in that part of the process before tackling it. And I think it led to stuff like where we see some of the stuff involving the Guardian, mm-hmm. where it's a newspaper thing.
Yeah,
that was one of the things that trying to figure that out was interesting. But I think that having that conversation led to that kind of thinking of how much could we fuss with the storytelling, expected storytelling, versus everything that came before it, while still feeling consistent with what came before it. But also, it was good that I had that conversation with him, because it gave me a good, clear idea of like, okay, I have to tackle each one of these characters and be true to what those creative teams did, instead of just sort of overriding anything that they did visually. I had to kind of capture that sensibility to some degree. So that was cool.
Now, what about working with Warren Ellis on Desolation Jones? Another, I would say, hold him to the same regard as, let's say, Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. I mean, just amazing, writers, and think outside the box, I would say. That must have been just another interesting experience.
Yeah, I in terms of a comparison between that experience versus everything else I had uh, been involved with up to that point, most of my career, I've had the luxury of working with writers that were very collaborative. So even going back to, I don't remember if I actually spoke to Chuck Dixon much on the phone with Justice Writers. But I think I probably did a couple times. Uh, and I had talked with Howard a little bit. I knew Howard from before that anyway. And of course, Alan was extremely collaborative. Grant was extremely collaborative. I think the only writer I really didn't get to talk with before then was when I did a couple tidbits for Justice League when Mark Waid was doing it.
Okay.
So I didn't get to really talk to him. So I was just working straight from the script and figuring that out. But in terms of like a larger project like Desolation Jones, it was an interesting learning curve for me in terms of navigating the behind the curtain aspect. So with Warren, I really didn't get to be in a collaborative mindset with him. For whatever reasons, he wasn't very communicative through email and things like that. So I kind of had to find my own way, and it was something I wasn't used to because I was used to being able to kind of try to have some sort of mental rapport.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't able to have that on Desolation Jones, and had to, on the first issue, kind of had to like, okay, this is just the way he works. I have to figure myself out and be okay with what I do with it, and so that was probably the biggest difference. The story behind, the story of Desolation Jones, that first arc is really brilliant stuff. It's like what I appreciated about that project was being able to tackle something that was so vastly different than Promethea or Seven Soldiers was. It was such a different kind of animal, which was, I think, a good thing for me to kind of cleanse that palette and try something different while still trying to experiment too and do some things that you might not expect out of a crime noir book. The whole aspect of the type of character that Jones was, and that he's this guy who's experimenting on, and he hallucinates and all this stuff, kind of like, you don't normally see that kind of thing in a crime noir anyway. So I think that kind of helped me feel like I could approach it from a different perspective than a typical, LA noir, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Moving to perhaps, and I guess this could be subjective, but what I would consider your most mainstream work, which is Batwoman. I'd love to know, again, another, amazing writer in Greg Rucka,
Yes.
how that all came about, and, were you familiar and or a fan of the character before coming up on the book? I mean, she was new, of course.
Yeah. She was so new. I had no idea of anything about her. The way that kind of came about was, let's see, the order of events here. Okay, so I was offered to take on Detective Comics with Paul Dini. I got the first issue of that done, but then I was still all in the mix of Seven Soldiers of Victory. And so everyone knew I had to go and do that last, bookend for that. Well, that took forever to get done. And then when that script finally came, they needed me to go do that. And then I would come back to Detective. So I only got to do one issue of Detective Comics with Paul. Super fun issue. And the plan was for me to do Seven Soldiers, then come back to Detective. And but Seven Soldiers took so long. It was such a tough task of a series because that last volume dabbles in so many different styles. I mean, there's sections that are fully painted and stuff. Um, by the time I was done, I couldn't come back to Detective Comics because uh, there was no way for me to for Paul. He was in such a rock and a hard place with the scripts that he couldn't write scripts far enough in advance for me to just start working away and those drop into publication when they were ready. And so that kind of left everyone in a conundrum trying to figure out, well, what do we have Jim do? I think maybe some of the Batman Black Glove stuff came up in that time period, but then the editor mentioned this Batwoman project with Greg Rucka, and I guess he had talked to Greg first before approaching me, and Greg was, told him he was stoked on the idea. And so they offered it to me. I just thought, oh, this is interesting because I'll get to be toying around in the Gotham universe, but in a way, build something from the ground up. Even though she had already appeared, I wasn't familiar with that stuff. I knew that the initial design of her was done by Alex Ross, which is funny that connection between me and Alex came up again. But they allowed me to go in and finesse different things, like give her different aspects in some of the design, as long as the basic silhouette was there. And so that was fun because, getting to work in that and build something from the ground up with Greg, even though we're dealing with iconography that's so familiar, I don't know, it was just a cool way to get into the Gotham universe more for me, to be kind of put a different stamp on it. And working with Greg was super collaborative too. We would speak often on the phone during the writing process and stuff. He wanted to pick my brain about different things. As an example, the first chapter in Batwoman's first appearance in Detective Comics, there was a scene in there where there was all the stuff he had to put into this first issue to get people cemented into who she is, who the supporting cast is, and all this, who the villain's going to be, that he only left himself room for 2 pages of an action scene. And so that led to a certain discussion about, like, well, if we approach it in a way to where the action feels bigger by the way it's presented, those 2 pages are more than just 2 pages by the way it feels. And so that crazy layout for that is from those kinds of conversations that we could have ahead of time. And so he felt more confident that he could write only a 2-page action scene and people would think it was dramatic, so yeah.
It sounds a little bit like what you were talking about with the Elseworlds books, in terms of something familiar, Gotham City, and a little bit of that backdrop, but also being able to, put a little bit of your own spin on it and world build even within the familiar elements.
Yeah.
And then you, on the Batwoman series, you stepped up to be also co-writer. Is that right?
Yes.
And what was that like in terms of flexing some different muscles than the artistic ones? Although you've always been a storyteller, obviously, in the way you're laying out the books.
Yeah. Well, it was an opportunity I really couldn't pass up. Greg was leaving DC for a variety of reasons. So editorial approached me. I think I had talked to them before that about possibly writing a mini series involving Batwoman and Wonder Woman, which ended up being folded into what we did in the main series in the third act, or third arc. But so when Greg was going to leave DC, they approached me to do it. I asked Greg about it, and he was like, "You got to do it." And so that's kind of what led to that. And I had dabbled with writing stories all the way back to Chase. So a lot of that stuff, when you look at the way we kind of spelled out in the credits box for Chase, it would be story by me and Dan, and then he would script. But I started getting more involved in the scripting process when we co-wrote Batman Snow for Legends of the Dark Knight, where I didn't draw it, and that was super cool. It was something I felt like I needed to do, and so when Batwoman was presented to me, it was kind of a scary prospect to take that on, especially after that first stuff was so well received from Greg. But I kind of had to do it. It was like one of those things like Wells, do or die. So, and I'm glad me and Hayden did it, because it helped inform how we approach what we're doing now with Echolands, and it gave me a different type of confidence to write those, co-write those scripts and stuff, and think about story, not just in little bites, but in the much bigger context of where do I want to go with something. So
working off of the your work on Batwoman, you received the GLAAD Media Award for that.
Yeah, it was very nice.
That must be amazing. Tell us a little bit about kind of how that came about, and it just it's just quite an accomplishment, certainly nowadays.
Yeah, I don't even know how it got nominated. We have no idea. I don't know if that was something that DC had done, or the people at GLAAD just got wind of what we were doing. I think, one of the things that helped propel that was Hayden and I approached the stories very much in the same way Greg would, in the same way I would approach any story. So like when I worked on Chase, creating stories with Chase, or with Batman Snow, the characters have to be, I have to view them as if they're real people. Mm-hmm. And in the writing process, sometimes characters actually talk to me in my head. As a weird example, there was something I was co-creating with somebody and was trying to figure out the main character, but in my head, his companion, his friend, started talking to me to tell me who the main character is. So that's kind of what I mean. It's a little weird. And so when we started to tackle Batwoman, our main goal was to, like, no matter how fantastic we get, how weird it gets, we wanted you to believe that she was somebody that you could be standing next to on a street corner, ready to cross to the other side of the road with. She's just like anybody else. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that helped in that response. I would think so. I've never spoken to anyone from the GLAAD Awards to kind of say, hey, why us? So I can only have my own assumptions based on the work that we did, and that people responded to the character because we wrote her as a human being, not just a superhero or just somebody who represents something. I think that's the key to writing all characters, is you have to believe that they're, they could have a whole life story to tell you if you gave them the time,
Right.
Yeah.
Very cool. I think that was particularly well-deserved because, like you said, she was not the first gay character in comics.
Sure.
And so you would think if that were the sole reason, GLAAD Award would have been given out earlier, but the portrayal was such that, to your point, realistic, human, sort of ground level, without catering or highlighting her sexuality, right. And therefore became, a three-dimensional portrayal that, as I said, worthy of the award.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we felt important to tackle as Kate's dealing with the supposed death of her sister for the second time, she thinks that she's dead.
Mm-hmm.
That brings up all the PTSD that she had from her childhood when she thought her twin sister had died in the first place as a kid. And so that kind of became our focus, was to focus in on the psychological pain and flaws that she would have, that anyone else would have under those similar circumstances. And I don't know, it just boils back down to what I was saying about writing characters that are human beings, you know. So
she was involved with Renee Montoya, right?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I forgot. Yeah, who I really enjoyed that character.
Yeah, for a short period. Then the way Greg wrote that stuff is that he had them break up, but sort of Renee was the love of her life, and but it just wasn't working between the two of them.
Look, you know, one's Batwoman, the other one's the Question. You know, look,
right.
It's gonna happen.
So Hayden and I paired her up with Maggie Sawyer, and that was going into really interesting places. Because the whole problem of vigilante in secret, you know, she's dating this, you know, Gotham PD detective, you know, it's like that whole thing was pretty interesting to focus in on.
So along the same lines of grounded, real human beings, let's talk about the Sandman. They like that segue. I'm sort of surprised, actually, given your career and your artistic tendencies, that Sandman Overture was the first time, unless I'm mistaken, that you were tapped to be in the Vertigo universe, or even be on Sandman. It seems almost preordained, in keeping with the subject matter, or just destined, because
it was a dream. No,
but yeah, maybe it was. Maybe it didn't happen. Because yeah, I think just the marriage of that material and that world with, you know, your artistic sensibilities just makes so much sense. How did you feel sort of receiving that assignment? Also, unless I'm mistaken, you may be one of the only, if not the only, that has worked with both Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman on significant runs of stories.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked into that particular statistic. But with Sandman, so the initial way that happened, it was funny that I ended up being offered a Vertigo project. I've always had been a Vertigo fan, particularly of, you know, Sandman universe stuff and Hellblazer in particular. Hellblazer is one of those things I always was like, oh, I would love to get my hands on that. But around the time that I was working on Batwoman, I was trying to get Echolands. I was like shopping Echolands around. And so Echolands was going to be the next thing after Batwoman. And Vertigo was, Wildstorm was interested in it, but also Vertigo was interested in it. And so I actually had meetings with them about it. Echolands almost ended up being a Vertigo project. But then Sandman comes along out of the blue. And by the time that came along, I had already set up and made arrangements for Echolands to be at Image. So that was everybody on Echolands I'm working with, everyone had assumed, okay, that's going to be where I'm going to move off to. But then Sandman came, you know, this long email from Karen Berger came saying, you know, this is this thing we want you to do. Neil has asked for you to do it, this and that. And I'm like, what? You know? of course, that put me in an interesting position because I'm like, well, what about my project? For Echolands, and so I ended up kind of figuring out what to do there by talking to everyone, even talking to Image, and Eric Stevenson over at Image was like, no, you got to go do the Sandman thing. We'll tackle Echolands after, my creative team of partners all agreed to, or like, oh no, you gotta go do that. And we didn't know it would take 3 years, of time before we could return to Echolands. Even thinking about it. But the way I came up in conversation to come on to Sandman was I had met Neil years and years before. I was probably still on Promethea at the time. And me and my wife were at San Diego convention, the SDCC convention, coming out of our hotel, and he was either getting in a cab or coming out of a cab. I'm not sure, but the cab was sitting there. The door was open. He's talking to 2 other people that I do not recognize. And I'm like, that's Neil Gaiman. And I'm kind of freaking out a little bit. And Wendy, my wife, she's like, you should go and, go up to him, try and introduce yourself. And I was like completely nervous about it. I'm like, no, he's in the middle of a conversation with people. And so we started walking towards the convention and we got, I don't know, 50 feet maybe. And I was like, this is stupid. I need to turn around and see if I can meet him. And so I did. But the funny thing about it, after the fact, because I just go up to him and I'm like, I just kind of butt into the conversation the first opportunity I can and say, oh, Neil, I just have to meet you. I want to shake your hand. I'm so-and-so. I, work with Alan on Promethea. And he's like, oh, I love Promethea. And I was like, oh, cool. And I'm like, I was just like, well, if you ever want to, do something together, that'd be incredible. And that was sort of the end of the conversation. And after the fact, I'm like, well, that was completely rude on my part. And years go by. I want to say it was probably had to be 8 years or something like that. It was a long time. And then I get this email from Karen about Sandman. I never spoke to Neil again after that. And in the first phone conversation I have with him after agreeing to do Sandman, I bring up the time that we met and how rude it was. And he's like, no, it wasn't rude at all. He was, I never forgot that you said you wanted to work with me. And so that's, sometimes just butting in can take you places. And that's how that kind of came about. And that was a dream project. I mean, no pun intended.
Yeah. So the since we're on the topic of Sandman, I have to ask, for one, what is your take on the series, the Netflix series, and do you think it's a pretty accurate adaptation of what was already printed?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think they did a really good job. I stepped away from it, regardless of some of the things that got altered. I felt like it was, it's one of the better adaptations that has been done. It had all the right spirit in it that you get from the original work. Yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed it. A lot of the changes that they made were interesting. Wasn't sure about some of it, without being able to pick Neil's brain or the other writers' brains about why this or why that. Yeah, I thought they did a really good job. I think the thing that threw me the most was probably the inclusion of Joanna Constantine.
Yeah.
But if it gets to return, I suspect they have bigger plans for that, and why they chose it. Because I kept wondering why just not kind of cut that out if you can't use John.
Right.
But Jenna Coleman's portrayal of the character, I mean, she's always riveting on screen. I just loved every aspect of it, and super curious where they're going to go with it. The fact that they got so many things feeling correct, like when he's having his every 100-year meeting with what's the character's name? I can't think of the character's name now, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the guy in the bar.
Yeah.
And, yep.
Yeah.
I can't think of his name either.
Yeah.
The way that was so great, the way they handled it and the way they dovetailed into it too. Yes. I thought was super great. I have no complaints. I really don't.
Do you foresee them using, some of the content you worked on, maybe folding that into future, I know I guess we're still waiting to hear what the if they're going to do like season 2, but right. Do you think they could possibly start weaving in some of the work you've done, or that content into future episodes?
Yeah, I'm curious how they would handle that, because the Sandman TV show would have to be on for a while before they could even get to the events of Overture and have it make sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Because Overture as a book is one of the things I loved so much about working on Overture in the first place was the fact that we were doing a science fiction tale that dealt with time loops. And so the events of Overture precede and end before and after, it's all before and after the main series, the way that it functions. So for them to get to that, and I'm curious how they would, they might be able to find ways to kind of weave it in more.
Yeah.
That might be what some of the things they were hinting at when during the first season, because there's quite a few Overture Easter eggs in there that I was surprised to see. So as an example, the gates to the dreaming, it's all the carvings on the gates are right out of a scene in Overture. Almost the exact panels actually carved into the gates. We get to see for a split second, we get to see Dream's ship, which was in Overture. When they show that in the dreaming. Also, the scene. Hopefully, this isn't too spoilery for people. But there's a scene in the first episode that's a sort of slightly different version of the same scene in Overture when he is confronting the Corinthian on the street in the show, is based on the same scene when he's confronting the Corinthian in his dream office back during this 1700s or whenever that was, Victorian era, I think it was. And in the comic, he is pulled away and then comes back and then is pulled away again. And when you find out, and then he ends up on that planet with all the other dreams in the comic, and all that stuff in Overture happens before he's captured, right, by the magicians, wannabe magicians. And so in the show, there's that scene where he's confronting the Corinthian on the street, and he's going to get pulled away in that scene. And if you notice, he's like all wispy and stuff, which is very much how I handled him a lot in Overture, where he was just smoky and amorphic. But in the show, he's got the helmet on. That was one thing that was different. And then we have that scene, and then when we see him again, he's crashing into the sigil captured by the magicians, but no one notices his clothes are completely different. So,
got it.
So Overture happens in the show between that scene and the end, in that scene where he's captured. So they're acknowledging the story of Overture there by using that scene. I was really surprised that they used the context of that scene in the show, basically acknowledging where that occurs. And then there's another scene further into this show where when he's having the duel of imagination with Lucifer.
Yes. Yep.
So in the show, he is able to defeat Lucifer in the imagination war by saying he is hope of the universe. So, and you see his vision of what that is, and because Lucifer is talking about the collapse of the universe, and we see the universe becoming darkness, and he says, but I am hope of the universe, and the universe springs back to life. That's a reference to Overture, and the little girl that he kind of embodies her hope to save the universe in the comic. So I think they're referencing that, touching on it with the hopes that they'll get to explain all that stuff. I don't know if Netflix will give them that. So,
it was an amazing series. I mean, it's a show that couldn't have been made years ago, but it's finally able to be made now. You know?
Right.
And yeah, it's great. So
yeah, and I like the way they kind of spread out the stuff with the Corinthian, the way they kind of weaved his story from the very beginning to the end of the first season. I thought that was really brilliant, the way they kind of did that, versus the comic is more like in chunks of that, where this was sort of dovetailed in and out much more cohesively, I felt like.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
it sounds like, I mean, we'll all cross our fingers and, knock on wood that more seasons are explored. But I like your explanation. I think Overture is in canon in the Sandman show.
Oh, yes. So, I mean, I don't know how spoilery we can get with Overture in terms of comic. I mean, the thing that is brilliant about Overture, but a little bit frustrating in the way it's promoted. Quite often DC promotes the series as a whole. Overture often is relegated to the side sometimes, when it's 150% integral to the entire thing. Overture explains the motivations that Morpheus has, as in the series when he's marching towards his inevitable end. The decisions he makes, in the series, you're like, I don't understand why is he doing this? What's this baby that he's involving himself with, and all this stuff. And Overture basically says, well, he had to save the universe, and the only way he could do that is because Daniel already existed in the future. Therefore, when he Daniel sends him the timepiece that he's able to use to save the universe. Therefore, Daniel must exist. So after the events of Overture, after he is captured and has to regain his strength, his mission now is to make sure that there will be another dream. Because if there isn't, he can't save the universe in the past.
Right. Yeah, I mean, how do people miss that?
Yeah, so that's super fascinating how integral Overture is. And when people ask in what order the books should be read, Neil often says, read the series, then read Overture, then read the series again. Because there's so much that you go, oh, that's what that's about. And talking to Neil, and when he was doing interviews about Overture, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand is Overture was a story he always intended to tell. It wasn't something that he just came up with on the fly. He always intended to go there. And we just, now was the time to do it, I guess, yeah, it was brilliant what he did there, and making it to where you have to read it over again because it's this giant time loop, and you're like, oh, okay, got it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. New way of grabbing our attention. You have to read the thing over again by reading this other book.
He will make you obsessed with it.
Right. Yes. You're powerless against
The magic
the
of
Sandman.
Yeah.
And its narrative structure.
Yeah.
So we've taken up a lot of your time, and thank you
that's
for
all
being
right.
so gracious with it. But we did want to
It's fine.
conclude with your current work on Echolands, and in that context, curious about how the story, how the project developed, and what made you want to make it in the format of what I think is an ongoing series, although of course in discrete stories. But how did this all come together, and why that format?
Well, Echolands was going way back. I was working on Promethea. I was at San Diego convention. All things happened there, apparently. I met Hayden Blackman there, my co-author, co-creator. At the time, he was working for LucasArts. He's Hayden's main thing is working in video games, either directing, story writing, being a CEO, you name it. He was a big fan of Promethea, and so some of us Wildstorm guys went out to dinner with the LucasArts guys, and everyone's geeking out on each other because they're like, LucasArts guys, oh, we're geeking out over the comics people, and the comics people are geeking out over the Lucas people, and so on. And he and I kind of hit it off and kind of stayed in touch a little bit, and that led to, I can't remember exactly how this occurred, but it led to us saying, hey, let's try to do something. And the first opportunity was a Hellboy short story for Hellboy Weird Tales. And Hayden did the script for that, and I drew it. I tried to paint it somewhat successfully, but we enjoyed the process a lot. And so I'm like, we should do something bigger. And I said, I've got this thing, this germ of an idea in my head centered on this character that I created as a child. This is the gist of what I think it is. Do you want to do this together? And he immediately could see its wide potential because it's a vast concept. And then we just started picking away at it and just, working as he's doing his thing and I'm doing my thing. We're picking away at it. It took, we picked away at it for 10 years probably, just like little conversations here and there and making little notes here and there and talking about like, well, what if we did this or what if we did that? And so all these ideas, loose ideas I had, or characters I had in my head from a child, found their way into this thing. Many of them evolved into something better through our conversations. Hope herself, the main character, Hope, probably has remained the most true to the way I envisioned her as a child. But I don't know, it was like this cool thing where we, two creative guys could just get together and see what we could come up with. And we came up with without giving away the secret of what the Echolands are, we came up with a concept where we could do any genre that we wanted to, but have it be this mashup of these things. So, in Echolands, you could have a cyborg elf standing next to a gunslinger, standing next to a biker Hun, standing next to a gangster from, an old Dick Tracy style reality. And it'll all make sense when we finally reveal how that functions and why it exists. And so we just kept picking away at this stuff. and doing our own thing. We actually have other concepts we've created together that are just waiting for their opportunity. But in this industry, it's amazing how much time can go by so quickly. Next thing we know, it's been years and years and years. Then the Batwoman thing comes, and then that's like, hey, Hayden, we should do this together. We've been exploring working together with this Echolands thing. Let's go do this Batwoman thing, and it gave us the opportunity to hone our skills as a writing team together and figure out how each other function in terms of writing scripts. Because up until that point, all we've been doing is developing concepts. This allowed us to kind of develop how we work together as a writing team for scripts. So it's good that Batwoman came before Echolands. Now, in terms of the format, some people either love the format or hate the format, and that's the landscape widescreen thing. We came up with doing that early on in our discussions, mainly because I myself, as you were noting before, how I like to experiment with things, was like, oh, what could I do with that? This would be interesting just for the challenge of it. And it is certainly a challenge, I'll tell you that. It changed the way I think about approaching a page. And the funny thing about that is before I started drawing a single page of Echolands, I was like, it'll be a piece of cake. It's not any different. It's the same inches. They're just in a different place. No big deal. No, it was such a huge learning curve that it's actually affected the way I have to think about a page, and so dramatically. And the way we write a page too had to change. But I think the hardest thing with Echolands is even today, because growing up in this industry, finding my way, I was working in the standard portrait size for such a long time. Granted, I messed with that when we went into Promethea and beyond that with Jones and everything that came after, to where I got so ingrained in doing the portrait format as double page spreads that became more and more of the thing I wanted to focus on, that we now started thinking about Echolands in the same way as spreads. So the format of the book, I feel, really lends itself well to the type of stories we're telling, the way we want it to feel. That extra wideness makes it feel more panoramic, more of an epic mythic fiction thing, as we've described it before. So it was, that challenge of going to landscape format was mainly just to try to do it, to see if it was possible, not really understanding that it was absolutely the right choice in retrospect. At first, when I started drawing the pages and I was having lots of trouble figuring out that puzzle, I was like, oh, maybe this was a mistake. But I've gotten to the point now where I've done a couple short stories going back to the standard format here and there while working on Echolands. I've gotten myself so spoiled with this format that I'm like, no, everything needs to be this format. What is wrong with everybody? Why can't we do everything this way? Yeah, it's super fun. So
very, very cool.
Yeah, I love the widescreen. The widescreen sort of cinematic.
I love that
views of things. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of some of the DC digital comics. For a while they were all the same kind
sort of panoramic scan kind of thing.
Yeah. Not that they were that good, but same type of setup. They were just digital, so they could they had that luxury of doing that. But
yeah, and the weird thing about it is, like, for the life of me, I don't know why I decided to try to do that. Like at the beginning, where I was like, hey, let's try to do it. Hayden was, kind of like, he was all for whatever I wanted to try. He was trusting my visual storytelling chops because he was already a fan of how I experimented to begin with. So he was all 100% on board. It was like having to convince him as a writer to try this idea. And I mean, I really not sure where it came from, other than the idea of like classic comic strips. You know, classic comic strips would have that kind of shape to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, why not? Let's try something that, you know, you don't see often. And some people are annoyed by it. Some people love it. Some people thought it was a terrible idea until they saw it. And then they're like, oh, now I understand. You know, it's interesting how just the format of a book can have an impact on people's perception of what the material is. When I first approached Image Comics about doing it in widescreen, matter of fact, everybody that we pitched the book to, we told them it would be this format, and no one was squawking about it. Image thought it was a really cool idea, and Eric Stevenson kind of, the way he talks about it was sort of like, just seeing the format alone, when you pick up the format and the shape is different, and you open it and some of the pages become like this, super wide, he says, just the format alone psychologically, subliminally tells you you're in the Echolands. So you entered someplace completely different, which is an interesting way to kind of think about it. The way he described that was super cool.
And we're back. That was a fun interview. Really interesting guy to talk to, and really cool stories about Neil Gaiman. I mean, you know, any story that begins with "he flew me to a bar" in UK, I believe it was, Scotland, whatever. That's got to be a cool story, right? So yeah, really fun interview, and I really like his work. It's fantastic. I got to tell you, what stood out to me when I initially saw his work is just his usage of the color red, specifically in like Batwoman. But great work. So that was a fun interview.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It was great to hear some of his creative process, some of the influences that go into his work, how he thinks about kind of breaking down the story into panels, if there are panels, but page by page. As we say in the promo, he's just a master of the double page spread, and I could just, you know, hang those on the wall, probably hang on the wall of a museum somewhere. Amazing work. We were glad to have JH in the hot seat with us for this episode. But that'll do it. This is the second to last episode of 2022. Next week, we have an interesting one. It's kind of our year in review. All three bandits are there, plus some guest stars. Mitch Halleck from Terrificon, the man behind that con, and Jean Michel from Mega Brain Comics. Yeah,
it's going to be a fun discussion. Goes off the rails a little, but in the absolute best way. Fun conversation. There's a lot of obviously movie discussion. We break down our thoughts on Black Adam. And since then, Mike has seen the movie. So just keep that in mind. But look, stay tuned. It's going to be a fun one, I promise.
Yeah, guys. Stick around for next week. And then 2023, season 3, we have a whole lot of goodness for you coming up. So please continue to listen. Thank you for listening today. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe, all that great stuff. Help us grow, get the word out. And we will see you next time for the last episode. Peace.
Bye.